Hi, this is Steve Hargadon, and it's the 26th of May, 2012, and I'm with Audrey Waters, and we're covering 2 weeks of her blog, Hack Education. Hi, Audrey.
Hello. Yeah, we missed last week's. We were busy with Maker Faire.
We were. So this will be fun, but we have made a commitment that we are going to each have the opportunity to say, move to the next story in order to not have things drag out too long. So Audrey and I both have the power to call a story and move quickly past. But we do want to try and cover as much as we can. Part of the reason I didn't want to skip last week was because of EdShelf.
Yes.
I thought this was a really interesting concept and one I'm not actually sure I'm comfortable with. So tell me what's going on.
So EdShelf, this was my attempt in some ways, I should say, at sort of the meta level. Imagine K-12, which is an education startup incubator in Silicon Valley, just graduated its last round, or its most recent round of startups. And I've been trying to cover as many of them as possible, sort of realizing that I hadn't done so. So EdShelf is one of this cohort, and it's something, they're addressing a problem that we've talked about here before several times on the podcast, which is that there's a flood of educational apps and websites and games, and it's very hard to know what's good, what works, what people like, what people don't like. And so EdShelf is sort of, in some ways you could think of it sort of as like a Yelp for educational apps. But the trick, though, of course, is, as any user of Yelp knows, is how do you actually know the person that's providing a review is someone worth listening to? And so I think that this is the problem that EdShelf is trying to address, but also very much faces as well. How do you make recommendations about quality educational content? Who do you trust? And then the company also wants to help provide a way, sort of integrate that, make it easier for teachers to sort of then buy, integrate products into their classroom.
Which was clearly the revenue play. And
Yeah.
I'm not sure I know enough to even kind of address that. There was so much I liked here, but in the end, I mean, I loved the social piece and the following and the ratings. But in the end, I came to this place of realizing that part of what I really like about educational technology right now is the degree to which it's not education focused, that it's about sort of broader learning, and that I don't know, I just got uncomfortable with the idea of sort of putting a category around it now. I'm not sure why.
No, I think that's a really interesting challenge, and it's something that I think several of the companies that we'll talk about that have had news in the last couple of weeks, make me think about as well. So you can recommend something in your classroom that doesn't necessarily fit under the category of education, and I think that that's a really good idea. But I mean, an example would be this sort of long-standing debate between, do you use PowerPoint, Keynote, or Prezi, for example? And I think that, I do think that having educators make recommendations to one another is a good thing. But I do think that it's still a challenge of getting user-generated reviews that are actually meanophyll. And I think EdShelf is trying to think about what is it that teachers want to know about a particular product before they opt to use it in their classroom.
Interesting. Okay, paying to learn. This is a story that I would almost kind of want to pass by quickly, but there was this sort of question about the financial incentives, or the incentives when you've paid a lot of money for a course. And I need to let you talk on that.
No, and I think it's something that I think that this is one of the challenges that we're seeing in lots of these free and in some ways open. Boy, we'll come back to that. We'll come back to that later, I'm sure. But free opportunities to learn things online that it just seems to be expected that the students many of the people who enroll will disappear. And what's interesting about this company, Block.io, is that they used to be a resource that anyone could sort of sign up for and take some online lessons. But now they're going the complete other direction. And not only are they charging quite a bit of money, it's certainly not as much as a college degree, but it's quite a bit of money to learn to program. But they're actually sort of they're really choosing carefully who actually gets to participate in their program. I mean, on one hand, you could say, well, that's just going to artificially inflate their completion stats. But they're really sort of putting up more walls to make sure that they can actually support and help students and find students that want to complete a class, rather than opening things up to the general public, and then not really having the mechanisms in place to support those learners when they do get stuck, when they do lose interest, and when they drop out.
There's a bold claim there that they know actually how to teach people to program.
That is a bold claim that many of these both, and I would say, that this is something that, that sort of some of these companies that have been funded, millions of dollars by investors, as well as perhaps some, institutions of higher learning as well, would know that too.
Okay, Teach Boost. Loved this idea. I want to make a connection with Deming, but wasn't quite sure how people would react to such a highly defined kind of methodology for measuring. Will people actually even use this system?
Yeah, this is an interesting a pretty interesting startup, and I think that they're one of these startups that I think is quite self-aware that they're going to have to pay attention really to what teachers and administrators want in their tool. None of the this is an engineer heavy startup, but none of them actually have sort of classroom training themselves. But they want to make a tool to help sort of help with teacher evaluation, to help with classroom observation, and to have it so that sort of it's easier to recognize on an ongoing real-time basis what's happening in a classroom, so that teachers can have their own sort of professional job evaluation without it just being the once or twice a year when the principal stops by the classroom, and from there all of this assessment happens in terms of teacher performance. So I think that there are some interesting things that they're working on, and I do think that we'll see, particularly if we can push to not have standardized test scores as be the measurement that we're using to evaluate teachers, then our alternatives really are classroom observation, peer observation, principal observation. And so I do think that there's some interesting opportunities here, as long as you're not building a surveillance tool. And I think TeachBoost is really trying not to have this be this awful, fearful thing, but something about developing capacity in teachers and in schools at large.
I love the trust language. Mm-hmm. Here's where I went with this. So I remember doing total quality and Deming material in business, 15 years ago.
Yeah.
And sort of the general consensus that it was really hard to systematize this, that in order to help give sort of frontline workers the training that they would need to be good at assessing and determining what was actually taking place in a manufacturing process, that it was a highly human, high-touch kind of interactivity. So then I'm thinking, okay, so, can you actually sort of put that into a system, or is the desire to create a program that would do this the result of needing to have a stronger monetization strategy? Because it feels like that a really good school would be doing this, but you would have to do it as a high-touch human thing and not through a computer system.
I think that in some ways this is, what TeachBoost is building is an alternative to what many classrooms and many schools are already using, which is a combination of paper, right? So that when a principal observes a class, she or he are making notes, in a notepad, and also the database that stores this in some ways is something like Excel. And so I think that they want to build something that's really flexible, that principals feel like they're able to have a mobile interface to take notes directly on their mobile device, or to jot quick notes, but then something that doesn't require a lot of transcribing and retranscribing and moving into different systems when the principal gets back to his desk and has to sort of type things up in a more extensive manner.
So the strategy here would be that you would be a teach boost school. Right? I
Yes,
mean, that's sort of lock, stock, and barrel. Everybody moves to this system,
right.
and I can see the value in that. Okay, so more digital textbooks for sales in college bookstores. So what? And it's hard to hold a war when nobody shows up.
This is one of the, it's so interesting to me to see all of this, so the steady release of news that I get from various digital publishers. Whether they're traditional publishers, traditional textbook publishers, and then these new sort of apps that are offering them. And the news last week was that Inkling was making a big distribution deal with Follett that owns 900 college bookstores in the U.S. So this is sort of a win. This is a win for Inkling in order to get their brand sort of on the posters and on the websites of a bunch of college bookstores. But I still haven't seen much indication that college students care. I just don't, and I think we've talked before about some of those reasons why there are. I mean, for now at least, Inkling is only available on the iPad. There are a lot of reasons why students just don't find digital textbooks to be as, quote, revolutionary or disruptive as I think some people are purporting them to be. And so I just don't think that the price is right. I don't think that the platform, you're sort of still locked into a platform. And so this is on one hand good news for Inkling, and then on the other hand it is pretty much a big so what in terms of students.
Fascinating. Library Box, I can pass on, but is there anything you want to talk about?
I think that this is I think that this is an interesting DIY device. This is built on the Pirate Box, and it's this notion that people have this idea of sort of hacking a tool that will be able to make a local area network with a bunch of free library materials on it. So I think it's a cool idea. It's a cool little hardware hack that I know that the creator Jason Griffey is looking for sort of help from folks who are good at hardware hacking or interested in the project. He's looking for sort of for input from folks. So I think it's a really interesting idea.
Maybe I'm a little jaded because I went through years of people promoting this idea of an open source kiosk, where you would have a place where anybody in a low income country could come and actually burn a CD with open source software on it. I just wondered if it was really needed. Where is the need for having access to digital book content if they have mobile devices where they wouldn't be able to get that already just from an online site?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that's a good question, and I think that it could just be making an easier portal for Project Gutenberg content, and I think that that's one of the questions that Griffey has as well. Sort of, what are the scenarios in which you could see using this? Why wouldn't people use their local library? And I think that there are reasons why people might not want to use local library, particularly in terms of privacy issues. So
interesting. Well, good. Unglue It. Fascinating.
yeah, I'm really excited about this project. I mean, this is another crowdfunding effort, a new crowdfunding platform, but with a twist. In this case, it's teaming up in order for folks to buy the rights to a particular piece of content, and not buy the rights outright, I should say, but make an agreement with publishers or with authors to release an free and openly licensed digital version of their book. In many cases, there are lots of resources out there that you still can't find in a digital format, and so I love this idea of people chipping in order to buy the digital rights, the open rights to release book content this way. I think it's a great idea.
I didn't recognize any of the titles.
No, and I think that's going to be one of the challenges. On the Unglue It site, you can sort of suggest the titles that you'd like to see, and I think that will be one of the challenges for this site is, can you get something that enough people are really interested into committing to release a copy, or to come together to raise the money to convince an estate or an author or a publisher to do this. And the way that the licensing works is that you could still sell other copies elsewhere. You could still retain a copyright to print versions, but they want to make it so that there are digital copies that can be shared, that aren't locked down with DRM. Just, like I could lend you a print copy of a book without having to sort of get an okay from an author or a publisher to make that transaction.
Part of what I loved about this story was just that it sort of twisted the notion of the crowdsourced funding ideas, and maybe just opens the door to thinking really creatively about how you could use this kind of crowdsourced funding.
Yes. To do something for the greater, this was one of the things when we talked a couple of weeks ago about the Kickstarter project and Mathalicious. The Mathalicious project ideally is a greater good, sort of how do we help improve math education. But I really like the Ungluit because it really is crowdsourcing for the greater good, and not just crowdfunding something so that the project gets funded, of course, but so that sort of you personally benefit because you get early access to that thing. It is very much it's pooling our money for the greater good.
How fun. Okay, so Bud Hunt says EdTech isn't a thing. It's a poor shorthand for a lot of other things. Do you agree?
I do agree. And I think that certainly now you think of the ubiquity of technology in our lives, and it's and this problem with what do we call an educational technology. So, what tools can actually be used, whether it's in the classroom or in the service of teaching and learning, that makes things like ed tech seem, in some ways, an outdated and also a very vague way of talking about specific tools that can be used in a classroom setting. And technology is so much more ubiquitous. And I think what we mean by learning is so broader than just a set of a piece of software or a piece of hardware that a third grade teacher is using in their math class.
I think it's intriguing that most of the people I know who came into these discussions through ed tech kind of graduate to the larger discussions of education.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly that was true for me with the Future of Education series, which started as really about technology, and now really is just about teaching and learning. And it feels like the conferences are maybe even going through the same kind of a desired transition.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think that when we label things as ed tech, and that I think that this is something that I framed this particular story in thinking about what do I cover on Hack Education. There are stories that aren't necessarily about education technology that I feel have great impact on whether they're policy issues, whether they're technology issues, and how do we think about the goal of ed tech, I would say, in some ways was about sort of how do we move these conversations, how do we advance the conversations around education and learning forward, and I think that in some ways ed tech feels as though it's too often still this siloed conversation around a set of technologies that doesn't feel like we're actually having the right conversation when we just look at things through that lens.
There is a little bit of sadness for me every time I walk past a room at an ed tech show that's the 20 tools for something, and it's packed to the gills. And then you've got a really deep sort of philosophical, pedagogical discussion somewhere else that has 3 people attending.
Right, I know. And I think that these are the challenges too. I think about this all the time in terms of the sorts of stories that I write myself, and the things that interest me. I'm not so interested in writing stories about 10 nifty ways to use Pinterest in your library. And I'm sure that those stories, lots more people read those stories than read, some of my longer rants. But I think it is about moving the conversation forward. And sometimes when we talk about ed tech, we're not able to have it is as Bud said, shorthand, and we aren't having a very nuanced or interesting conversation because we're just assuming people know what we mean, and we're not really spelling that out sufficiently.
So does this mean there will no longer be the sort of obligatory weekly apology from Audrey that the story really isn't about educational technology, but you want to make sure it gets covered?
Yes, there will be no more. There will be no
No
more
more
apology.
apologies.
Except for I did think today, or I guess yesterday, when I published my EdTech, my EdTech news roundup, I was like, oh, I still called it EdTech. So I do still need to think about headlines, I suppose.
So I'm going to let you make the call on Learn Sprout. Do we talk about that or move on?
I think that I actually think that Learn Sprout is doing something really important. And I've written a number of times in the last couple of months about one of the really crucial pieces that the education technology software, and I do mean this legacy software, suffers from is not having open data, not having APIs, really resting on the assumption that student data is trapped in a silo. And I think LearnSprout is working on creating an API so that to help sort of crack open some of these silos around student data. I think it's a really important idea, and I think that they have a very strong technical team that I'm actually thrilled. I mean, this ties back into this. I didn't really spell it out, but this ties back into these questions around the Facebook IPO too. I'm thrilled to see a team of strong engineers, a former Facebooker, former Googler, former Microsofter, strong engineering team work on engineering solutions for education. I think that this is definitely a company to pay attention to.
Terrific. Okay, Maker Faire.
Yay!
So I was part of the DIY Learning Pavilion that Betsy Corcoran set up and Ed Surge sort of hosted, where we did activities all day Thursday for teachers, and then on Saturday and Sunday had a series of interviews. And this was my first time at the event, and I absolutely loved it.
Yes. I mean, tell me what were your thoughts then as someone who'd never attended before?
Okay, I loved the kind of family focus.
Mm-hmm.
I love the serendipity of it, which is sort of finding things that you might be interested in and everybody having a different interest. I love the sort of non-assessment kind of environment.
Yeah.
That there was just all of this sort of fun making together. And I kept thinking of all of the things that I loved doing. I mean, Radio Shack was my best friend as a high schooler. And I'd sort of forgotten that. But I used to go down to Radio Shack and I'd go to the audio electronics store. And those are things that I actually kind of wish I'd taken further.
I think this was my second time at Maker Faire, and I brought my son this time, particularly after the experience I had my first time there too. I thought, this is a great family event, and I just don't want my kid to miss out on it. But I think that experience, as somebody who growing up loved to, I loved to make things by hand. I loved to sew things. I loved to assemble things. I loved art and science, and I love Maker Faire that it's this really open, and experimental and creative crowd of folks who've just built unbelievably cool things, and they're willing to let you touch it and play with it and ask questions and experiment and be inspired by them.
It was really an enjoyable time for me. It announced at that event was the Maker Education Initiative. And I think this is maybe kind of a good window into Dale Doherty and O'Reilly and their sense of how they can make a difference.
Mm-hmm.
And I interviewed Dale as part of the interview series, and we talked about this particular initiative, which has a lot more in common with school gardens and robotics clubs than it does with sort of traditional formal education.
Yeah, I think, this is one of the things I think about a lot in terms of what the priorities of formal education have become as well, because I think I think that, I mean, I certainly remember growing up having a lot of opportunities in the classroom, not just extracurricular activities, but in the classroom to make and build. There was shop class, there was cooking class in junior high and high school, but even in the younger grades, that we did a lot of hands-on building. There were a lot of projects and those projects were windows into science, windows into art, and so there's just a very open and satisfying learning experience as a kid. And I feel as though formal education has been a lot of that experimentation and hands-on learning has sort of been sucked out of the system. And thankfully, it exists at the margins. It exists in after-school programs. It exists in people's homes. It exists in libraries oftentimes. But you're sort of thinking about, what is it about the formal system that has become so devoid of the joy of making, and how can we help make those connections back into the classroom? I mean, these are the things that I think keep kids interested in learning.
Well, intriguingly, DARPA is the funder of the Maker
Yes.
Education Initiative. But I clearly get the sense from Dale that he's not really that interested in getting involved in the assessment questions or
Nope.
anything else. He's just interested in doing something that will provide an opportunity for students to be kind of learning agents in this very physical way.
Yeah, and I think that agency is the key in so many ways to this. You can see this is something that, I mean, even just watching my son, my 19-year-old son walk around sort of in awe, and just, for him to be able to sort of recognize and assess, think about his own agency in terms of what he wants to do, what he wants to build, the skills he'd need to perhaps pursue in order to do things well. But it gives you a different sense, I think, as a learner throughout your life, and the things that you need to do in order to make and build what you want to do. I mean, to be able to tap into and succeed in your own creative projects it's very self-driven, intense, instead of like the top down, this is the curriculum, and now everyone open your textbooks to page 250 and we'll learn about photosynthesis. It's just a very different way of the learner being in charge of what they're doing.
So Steve and Audrey, give Maker Faire 2 thumbs up.
Yes.
Okay, Grocket launches Learnist. Now, I have a little bit of a conflict of interest here because I'm doing consulting work for Gina Bianchini around her project called Mighty Bell. So I don't really feel like I want to weigh in a whole lot here, but tell us about Learnist and what's happened.
So this is I think a very interesting pivot on the part of a test prep company that's been around for 6 years now. So Grocket they describe themselves as a social learning company, and you can certainly see that social learning component in Learnist. But really what Grocket's been doing for the last few years is test prep. This week, however, they've launched Learnist, which I described, and I think anyone who sort of has looked at it has probably described it as a Pinterest for education. So you're able to sort of create bulletin boards, or boards, or digital boards, in which you can sort of share and organize learning items, learnings they're calling them, and arrange them in a way, and then have these social conversations around what you're trying to share with others. So this is an interesting move away from test prep towards this social, this sort of the social element. It's a move away from thinking about how do you use a website or a service in order to just sort of score well on the SATs or score well on the AP calculus exam, in terms of how do you build a community of learners who you'll go back to and interact with time and time again, on a variety of subjects across time. So I think it's an interesting move for Grocket as a company. In terms of, I've seen there's been a huge amount of interest in Pinterest since it launched. I think a lot of educators and librarians have seen it as a potentially valuable tool in their classrooms. And coming back to the conversation we had earlier in this podcast, what does it mean when we have something like this designed specifically for education? Can we have the tool be designed in such a way that it actually works better for teaching and learning?
Initial impressions?
Initial impressions. I think that on one hand, there are a lot of a lot of the boards on Grocket are very informal. It's sort of how do you find the best pizza in Brooklyn, which is and sort of then how do you make homemade pizza from scratch, which is perhaps sort of the emphasis so far, at least since it's been in closed beta, has been on more of these informal things. So I think it's going to be sort of a wait and see in terms of who participates, what the community looks like that builds and shares what they know. I think that in some ways, with all this attention in Pinterest, will some of that move over to Learnist, and I think it has a nice design. I think that there's certainly a lot of interesting conversation going on around things, but will this be something useful for people? I think it's time will tell.
So you claim to want to avoid graduation speeches, but you linked to 2 or 3
I did.
that I thought were quite brilliant. So I wasn't quite sure if you really want to avoid them or you just want to pick and choose.
Well, I think I want to pick and choose. I mean, I think that of all of the colleges and high schools that are holding their graduations, around this time of year, I do think that most of the time you'll find that these speeches are they're stock of, they have the same sorts of sets of advice for graduates, sort of, be brave, the world is your oyster, go out and do great things. And I think that I do think that it's the rare graduation speech that's actually that compelling. That being said, I mean, I have a fondness for good oratory. I think is always enjoyable to listen to, and I think that Neil Gaiman's talk that he gave last week was particularly inspiring. But I also was really inspired by Adam Savage speaking at Maker Faire, and this wasn't a graduation speech, but it was very much a speech about go out and build things, go out and do great things. And I do think that, how can perhaps we shouldn't just have a moment for graduates, whether they're high school graduates or college graduates, in which they get to hear those words to go out and make the most of yourself. And so I suppose that's the great thing about YouTube, is that we can all find inspiration by, Steve Jobs' speech, whether or not we were sort of part of the Stanford class of 2005 or not.
Right. So part of it is just sort of the incredible capability now of having all of these archived video records.
Yes.
My thought was somebody should teach a high school class using graduation speeches as their sole content. Go through Randy Pausch.
Yes.
That's not a graduation speech, but go through these great speeches and actually use it as the sort of the core content for a personal development class.
Well, actually, I think that the Randy Pausch stuff is an interesting addition to this, and Adam Savage at Maker Faire, and he's actually given several years worth of Maker Faire speeches that are really, really interesting and I think important for folks to hear about. And unfortunately, I think in this country, oratory is often associated with sort of what politicians say, and those tend to be so empty. I mean, sadly, probably many graduation speeches are empty too, but there's something really powerful about listening to somebody take you through a performance and then convince you, the listener, to sort of seize the reins of your own life. That I think is really inspiring, and we shouldn't just restrict it to the 22-year-olds that have successfully completed their bachelor's degrees and their parents who've successfully paid for it.
So I think we need another Audrey list, right? The top 20 videos every high school student should watch. Put Adams on there. Put Randy Pausch. Let's make that list, and then I'll try it out with my daughter.
There you go.
She'll say, "Dad, you're doing another one of your experiments again." Okay, so you and I both attended the Open Education Summit,
Yes.
which was maybe not as open as we wanted it to be, but also raised some very interesting issues about openness in education. For me, it felt a little bit like deja vu all over again from the open source conversations of 5 or 6 years ago. What was the core idea behind the meeting, and do you feel like there is movement here that's valuable?
Well, I mean, this is sort of my turn to reveal my connection to things. But I'm actually co-chairing the education strand at OSCON this year, which is an O'Reilly conference, the open source conference that's held every summer, typically in Portland. And this year there's a specific education strand, although there have been, I mean, you've spoken at OSCON before. There have been plenty of education talks at OSCON, but they're trying to sort of carve out a space to think about specifically about open education, and I and so part of the Open Education Summit this past week was sort of get ideas and potential speakers for that event. But I think one of the things that was really interesting, and I think both you and I were thinking about this too, is that what do we mean by open? What does that adjective actually mean? You know, in terms of open source, at OSCON, it's about the source code being made available. Sometimes it's a licensing question around how the material, the code, or the content is being licensed. But it seems as though open is being bandied about, the term open is being bandied about fairly often now. And it's not really clear that we're all on the same page when we talk about openness.
Not just that we're not on the same page, but it feels like openness exists at several levels in education.
Mm-hmm.
So openness of source code is very different but related to an open educational resource or Creative Commons licensing
Right.
for written content or for video content, which is different than open APIs,
Mm-hmm.
which is different than open platforms, right? So it's not just that there are maybe different agendas, but there's also different levels. And I left feeling a little bit confused.
Yeah, and I think that, I mean, and in some ways, the openness or particularly when we're talking about licensing is, I mean, someone said this in one of the sessions at the Open Education Summit. It's about reducing friction. It's about, this openly licensed code or content makes it so that other people, you can innovate more rapidly so that other people can sort of use things in ways that the creator didn't necessarily anticipate, that you can iterate more rapidly and ideally, of course, sort of address problems more easily. But I think that I'm not sure that when we talk about openness, we're just talking about licensing, and I think that we're talking about things as well. We're talking about issues of transparency. We're talking about data and metadata that don't have that same licensing model, and we're thinking, and sometimes we're thinking about these other organizations that have created these licensing models that maybe haven't done so, thinking about educational institutions specifically. So, is there something different about education that would make us rethink or have perhaps asterisks by certain licensing models for exceptions around educational uses?
Interesting. Okay, well, we actually did a fairly good job of covering your
Yeah,
blog
we
posts,
did. We got through pretty quickly. Not
so
too
we can
shabby.
go into the stories. Why is the Facebook IPO a story you care about?
Well, I think that, I mean, it's been really interesting the fact that the Facebook IPO is sort of still in the news 1 week later. Um, this was one of the things that sort of, along with Bud Hunt's tweet, this has been making me think about which stories should I talk about. The Facebook IPO, I think, is going to be an interesting bellwether in terms of Silicon Valley investment, the success of technology, of sort of new technology companies and IPOs. It's created a bunch of millionaires and billionaires in the valley, and Mark Zuckerberg has at least in the past been interested in education investment. So I do think that it's perhaps not directly connected to the education system, but I do think that it's going to have repercussions on certainly on in Silicon Valley around technology and investing, and a new set of entrepreneurs that might feel now that they can go out and do things for education.
And I think quite directly for me, we're beginning to recognize the social aspects of learning.
Mm-hmm.
And Facebook is a part of that story.
Yeah, and I think, and it's also a question of data. How is Facebook making money right now? They're making money on ads, but I don't think any of us have, we all know that Facebook's making money on our data. So I think that there are lots of questions for us, in terms of business models, in terms of personal control of our data, that Facebook should make us consider.
The wacky story of the week: New Jersey third graders are asked to write about a secret they had kept, in past tense, obviously.
Yeah, I think that this has been an interesting spring term for standardized tests. Bad news after bad news after bad news, or good news, perhaps, depending on how you want to spin it. But the fact that this question ended up on a test, asking students to sort of confess a secret, again, was a lot of people pointed to the signs that we are really not thinking through what we're asking students to do, both in sort of intellectually and certainly in this case sort of philosophically, about when it comes to answering test questions.
But the Florida public school students had a dramatic improvement in their test scores, didn't they?
Yeah, I mean, and again, this is another example of how I think we're seeing sort of the emperor has no clothes in terms of all of this hand wringing that we do around test scores. That once the Florida standardized test scores dipped so low, right, that they were down 81% over last year, that the State Board of Education just decided to rethink what constituted a passing score, and then suddenly now 81% of students are passing. So it's really it's pretty clear how sort of arbitrary, how sort of sadly arbitrary what some of these scores are that we're putting so much weight into.
Arbitrary in one sense, but so clearly tied to things other than actual learning.
Right.
So Google Docs now has this brilliant, lovely Google research feature. At the same time that I can now no longer publish directly from Google Docs to Blogger.
Oh, but really? I didn't. Interesting.
It used to be you could publish directly from Google Docs, which made Google Docs a really great tool for creating your drafts for Blogger. And with this research tool, Google Research would have made it even more compelling. But still, obviously, a really nice feature. So what's going on here?
Well, I think it is really interesting to see Google make some tweaks to some of its core services, and certainly the introduction of the knowledge graph, I thought, was an indication that Google sort of remembered that one of the things it does best is help people find things on the internet. I mean, that is why Google is a verb for search. Or synonymous for search, is because once upon a time you would use Google. Google was the premier tool to search, and I think we've talked a lot lately about the changes to Google and some of these upstart search companies, partially because Google wasn't seeming like it was such a great tool. I think the new knowledge graph, which I need to sort of circle back around and write another story on, is an interesting way of Google sort of surfacing and using the semantic web too to surface really relevant and meaningful things when you search for an item, to help sort of improve things beyond just that initial list of like the top 10 blue links. They're surfacing more relevant information on that sidebar for you.
If you haven't played with Google Research, it's well worth doing it. Just go into your existing Google Docs. Has it rolled out to everyone?
I think it has.
And then just under Tools, click on Research, and you'll get a sidebar that lets you do all kinds of fun searching, and we'll do automatic searching based on the things in your Google Doc. 11.7 million purchases 50,000 Exo laptops. That had to be good news for them.
Yeah, I think I'm on the bad list for the one laptop per child, folks. It was great. It was great. Go team.
Okay, K-12 Horizon Report has been released. That's not super new news because they did some sort of advanced press, but anything that you noticed there that was worth remarking on?
No, I mean, I think it's for me. It's always interesting to see the timeline, how the timeline for what's on the horizon in the short term, how sometimes how right those things can be, and then the things that sort of sit on the short term horizon for sort of years and years and years. They've said apps and tablets are on the short term. I think the tablet piece is interesting to me, as I've still not seen a company who's offering something that most folks would nod and say that's a rival to the iPad.
Interesting. Larry Johnson was on The Future of Education and was very thoughtful about the shortcomings and the quirks of those lists, but how they still have value and worth listening to if anybody's interested in drilling down at futureofeducation.com. Okay, the city of Philadelphia. I haven't followed up on this particular piece of news, but are they really closing 64 schools?
This I haven't circled back around to find out what is happening this, but the last I heard, yes, that the city will be, they're calling it restructuring or dissolving their public school system in order to close again underperforming schools in their words, and in their place replacing these with a charter school network.
Fascinating. I know they've been struggling, and Chris Lehman talks a lot about the struggles in Philadelphia city schools, but I'm sure we'll hear more.
Yeah.
Is it Houghton Mifflin? How do you pronounce the name? Houghton Mifflin?
Houghton.
So Houghton
but we
Mifflin,
won't have to worry about them for too long.
well, so how is it that a textbook publisher could be declaring bankruptcy right now? Or is this a harbinger?
I think that it's...
I thought they were all rolling in money.
I think that some of them are rolling in money. I think that certainly if you look at McGraw-Hill or Pearson, they have a lot of other properties that they own that may or may not be struggling, may or may not be sort of making up for the changing business world around publishing. I think the fact that we're seeing this major, I think that this is the number 3 or 4 textbook provider in this country file for Chapter 11, is pretty indicative of where the future goes, or perhaps what the future holds for many publishers, not just textbook publishers, but the traditional publishing industry in general.
In the quiet story that I think has deeper ramifications than are evident on the surface is David Coleman becoming head of the College Board.
Yes, this is interestingly timed, considering that we have had a couple of stories in the last few weeks about the amount of money that the College Board is making. This is a really influential, and perhaps not a nonprofit that we think of as a really influential power player in terms of education policy and testing, but certainly the College Board is a major player in the U.S. education system. And David Coleman will be taking over, I believe, this fall. And he is, in fact, one of the architects of the Common Core. He wants to redo a lot of the College Board's assessments to reflect the Common Core standards. He has a strong belief in what students should be learning, what students should be reading, what students should be writing about. he was, famously quipped that students shouldn't write personal experience narratives because when you grow up, nobody cares what you think. And so this is a person who has a pretty set idea of what learning should look like. That is now going to be dictating what the tests will look like, and for the time being, at least, what the tests do seem to dictate the curriculum.
Yeah, it seems like that's going to become that's going to have significant impact.
Yeah.
Udemy releases some figures that kind of stunned me. The top 10 earning teachers on their platform have brought in $1.6 million over the past year. So I know that doesn't spread equally, but that's still a lot of money.
That is a lot of money. I mean, I think that what's interesting, I think, and Udemy has sort of benefited, I think, by having itself named in among some of these hot new companies like Udacity and Coursera. But what's interesting is I think that we're seeing these top earning instructors were all teaching programming classes. So I think it's definitely an indication that there is a lot of money in alternatives to, again, the alternatives to higher ed, alternatives to the bachelor's degree for folks who want to learn how to program, or folks who want to learn a particular programming language.
Peter Thiel, who's famously told people to drop out of college, requires a college degree to
Yeah.
work at for him.
Yeah,
Is that true?
that is true. Yes, and Peter Thiel was on 60 Minutes last weekend as well, touting his the program where he offers 20 students under age 20 $100,000 to drop out of college. He's really hung his hat on a sort of anti-higher education mantra, even though the man has multiple degrees himself and is teaching a class at Stanford this term, and now, according to his VC company, does require that you have a bachelor's degree from an elite institution with a high GPA in order to work for him. But I wouldn't dare call him a hypocrite, right?
Mozilla unveils Mozilla WebMaker.
Yes. So this is great. I mean, the news from Mozilla and the news from Make and O'Reilly about making is clearly we're seeing. I think we're seeing some strong interest in, again, sort of these hands-on, building your own, learning how to be a maker and a builder of technology. Mozilla's this new program for Mozilla is really beefing up Mozilla's presence as a learning organization. They want people to learn how to build and make for the web. So they have a couple of tools in place that we've talked about before, community efforts like Hive, and a real strong commitment now with classes and projects and templates to help people learn how to make for the web. I think it's great.
So I interviewed a man named Mark Tucker, who wrote a book called Surpassing Shanghai, and he looked at this top 6 performing countries for the PISA test. And if we sort of took the approach of industrial benchmarking, what could we actually learn from them? 2 really interesting conclusions. One was none of our current reform efforts are being done by any of the countries that are really feeling successful as educational initiatives. The second was that one of our biggest problems is that we don't just sort of let educators alone outside of the political process to figure out how to make things better. So when I heard Mitt Romney's proposal for education, I thought, what kind of a mistake is it that we expect our presidents to have strong views about education when clearly this is a non-productive exercise?
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting. I mean, and this is, again, I say this sort of colored by the fact that I spent the weekend, around Maker Faire, thinking about the work that I did with Mozilla and talking through thinking about how to empower learners to make and build and think about their own education. And then when you get these policies in place that are still very much based around assessment, assessment. I don't know, I'm not sure why the disconnect, except for in such a cynical way.
Yeah, well, clearly we have an expectation that candidates are going to have an education platform, and my sense is that they end up having to sound more refined or concrete than they. How was it that Mitt Romney would know anything about the depth of this discussion, right? And we've seen the results of President Bush and President Obama and the high level of involvement in education and the ending sort of consequences. Is there any way out of this? Is there any way to remove this education discussion from the front line of politics?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think as long as it's as long as there's sort of taxpayer dollars, I don't think that we'll ever depoliticize it entirely. And I think too, as long as we're using, as long as we're still sort of trapped in this notion of competition and around our school system, again, based on pointing to what our test scores look like, I'm just not sure that we're even thinking about much other than the testing regime. And how can we sort of look better in terms of other countries when we're quantifying school in that way?
Quite sad, actually.
Yeah.
Which is a quick lead into your race to the top note.
Well, right. I mean, I think, the race to the top, I mean, this is, I think this is going to be one of the interesting things to watch in terms of the education platforms that are put forward both by, Mitt Romney, laid his out this week, but also Barack Obama, because although, Mitt Romney surrounded himself by lots of George W. Bush officials, folks who were instrumental in that administration's education plans. Really, it's hard to look at what Barack Obama has done and see it being an improvement over No Child Left Behind. The race to the top again is shrouded in this competitive language. I mean, and literally sort of competitive funding mechanisms whereby schools or states initially, but now schools and districts are being asked or compelled really to conform to the administration's will in order to get more money. I think that it's really sad.
Okay. I don't know what your intent was with this story, or if I'm making a connection which is not okay. But additionally sad for me was this particular phrase: a digital education platform that uses predictive analytics to help guide educational decision making.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, I think that these are the conversations that we're having now around, it was interesting for me I should back up. I can explain this more. This was The Atlantic covered the launch of a company called Civitas Learning, which does just that: predictive analytics to help you make better educational decisions. And what was interesting in part was that this was founded by a former Kaplan executive, and thinking about Kaplan as being this long-standing name associated with test prep. Now making the move from test prep to predictive analytics and educational decision making, and then also thinking about Grocket making the move away from test prep as well. But this notion around learning analytics and data and what we're doing with that data, I think is something to really think about who's having the conversations around analytics and to what end, and what data are we actually looking at too.
Okay, so tell me about this Professor Kelly and the lying about the past class.
So Mills Kelly is a history professor at George Mason University, and he teaches a class called "Lying About the Past," in which the class in general sort of talks about it's a it's a history class in which we sort of think about the discipline of history, and also the practice of historians, but also how do we know sort of how do we know history, who gets to tell history, and what historical hoaxes have been perpetuated on us. And of course, a hoax isn't just sort of like, oops, we got the story wrong, but a hoax is we deliberately have told the wrong story here. So he teaches a class in which, in part, the final assignment, he divides the class into groups, and they have to create a historical hoax and think about what it means to do so, both sort of practically and philosophically. So his class this term, this isn't the first time he's taught the class. They created a couple of hoaxes, one of which was sort of found out right away. The other one sort of didn't really get any adoption, but Reddit and Wikipedia found out about his class, and then The Atlantic wrote a story about it. And he has been sort of called sort of the pond scum of the internet, being sort of raked over the coals for having his students lie on the internet. And even though he wasn't asking anyone to sort of falsify Wikipedia entries or anything of the sort, he's really just been raked over the coals for I think was assignments that people were just not really understanding what the idea of the class is, what the students were learning and what the students were doing. And as a result, he's been under attack, I would say, by members of the internet, that he's decided to sort of pull his online profiles. He shut down his Twitter account and his blog.
Interesting. I wasn't aware of any of this, but obviously I'll pay attention now. Students enrolled in a hybrid format statistics class took 1/4 less time to achieve essentially the same learning outcomes as traditional format students. You sound skeptical.
Well, I think that I'm skeptical. I think of all of this interest right now that we have about anything that we are able to mechanize in terms of higher education, or in terms of education, whether it's robot graders in this case. Steve Kolowich called them robot tutors. Moving students quickly through material sounds like it's great, but I'm just not sure. I'm not sure we should be sort of so over the top with excitement about thinking about education as the sort of mechanized process. Like, is speed and efficiency really what we want to course correct for? Is efficiency what matters in education?
For the first time, the majority of the unemployed have been college attendees.
Yes. And I think that this is a story that makes great headlines. It certainly feeds the Peter Thiel argument that college is a waste of time. I think that there's another way to look at the statistic too, which is, it's not just that that we're in difficult economic times. It's not just that it's hard for anyone to get a job, whether you have, but I think it's particularly hard to get a job if you don't have a college degree. It's still, the unemployment rate for folks without college education is still much higher than those with college education. And to me, I think it's this indication that we're seeing lots of people enroll in school, but we're not seeing everybody graduate with degrees. And so, to me, it's sort of how do we help those students complete college, get their degrees, and not just sort of how do we say, oh, college is clearly a waste of time because look, people with college education are unemployed.
McGraw-Hill says they want to acquire education startups.
Yeah, my response is let's hope they don't go belly up.
Is this kind of in response, do you think, to Pearson's investment in Startup Weekend EDU?
I do think it is. I do think it is. I think that Pearson has Pearson has made it fairly clear that they want to be seen as the hip and innovative, corporate giant. And so McGraw-Hill held a special press conference, really with the message being, we want to acquire startups too.
Interesting. Hard not to feel like these are just bandwagons that people jump on.
Well, I mean, and it's hard, you have, I mean, I think a lot about what is it that startups can do in terms of their agility, in terms of their ability to work more closely with teachers, just because of the shorter feedback loop. And then what happens when your startup is acquired by a company, whether it's Pearson or McGraw-Hill or Google or Facebook, that, I mean, they aren't necessarily interested in your innovation. They aren't necessarily interested in maintaining the direction that your company is going. There are a lot of reasons why startups get acquired, and oftentimes what's innovative gets shut down.
Well, it's going to have to be mostly about revenue.
Right. Or eliminating the competition, which is a revenue question, but
P2PU unveils a set of free and open professional development classes over the summer. Feels like this is a tidal wave coming of online courses like this.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, and the P2PU School of Ed have quite a few classes. I mean, I just listed a few in my roundup, but quite a few classes of folks. And unlike some of the other P2PU classes that don't have a clear starting or ending date, these do have a set time frame if you want to participate in some synchronous PD opportunities over the summer. So worth checking out. They're free, and P2PU has a great community. So.
Is anybody keeping a list anywhere of all of these online courses available to educators?
I don't know. Someone must be.
Maybe worth thinking about.
Yeah.
Mathalicious goes back to the drawing board.
Back to the drawing board. The canceled their, I don't remember what it was now, like $160,000 campaign. Set the goal much, much lower, $20,000. Of course, without, they won't be making a year's worth of videos, but I think it's a smart move. I mean, I think that it's asking a lot of folks to make the leap of faith to raise that much money. So here's hoping that the lowering that will help them meet their goal.
Let's hope so. Okay, hey, we covered a lot.
Yeah, we did. We burned through it very not too bad.
So there are good stories that we didn't cover, and they're available at Audrey's blog, hackeducation.com. Thanks, Audrey.
Yeah, thank you. Talk to you next week.